Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Mr. Simon Barber from Ludgrove School, Berkshire, Mr. Bart Wielenga from Blundell School, Devon, Mr. Richard Jones from Bryanston School, Dorset, and Mr. Gary Hickey from Haberdashers Adams, Shropshire. Founded in 1892, Ludgrove is an independent school offering fortnightly boarding for boys aged 8 to 13. This fortnightly boarding allows boys and their families to find a balance between part-time and full-time boarding, easing the transition into full boarding as the boys get older. The school's principal aims are for them to grow and develop in a happy, caring environment, to explore and expand their potential, and to learn to develop an awareness and concern for others around them. The school aims to enable boys to meet future challenges and opportunities with confidence, good manners, and humour. Blundell School is an independent co-educational day and boarding school located in Tiverton, Devon. Regardless of whether a student starts their pre-prep or sixth form, Blundell's ensures that every pupil gets the complete Blundell's experience. They possess a strong academic ethos whilst also maintaining traditional values of family life, viewing education as a means of developing students into young men and women who are prepared to make a meaningful difference within their communities. The school motto, Non Sibi, encourages three values: courtesy, selflessness, and empathy, which enables students to go on to enjoy lives of consequence and fulfilment. Bryanston School is a co-educational day and boarding school for students aged 3 to 18. Renowned for its success in creative thinking, Bryanston fosters an inspiring, open-minded culture and strives to help children find and pursue their individual passions. Every child at Bryanston reaches their fullest academic potential and is given the opportunity to become the very best they can be. The school promises that the education they provide will give their students confidence, strength, purpose, and a mind prepared for anything. Haberdashers Adams is a selective, co-educational state grammar school with boarding for boys in Shropshire. The 365-year-old school has an enviable reputation for academic, musical, and sporting excellence, along with a strong house system and a huge variety of enrichment activities. Pupils benefit from an active old Novaportan alumni community and valuable links to the City of London provided by the Haberdashers Livery Company. In essence, pupils are able to enjoy a free grammar school education and full boarding at a third of the cost of many independent boarding schools and often less than London day school fees. It's wonderful to have you all here representing the different aspects of boarding school provision available to parents and families in the UK. Firstly, would each of you like to introduce your school and the boarding provision beyond what I've already said? If there's anything you'd like to add on what you feel you offer families, perhaps if we start with Simon.
Good afternoon. Yes, Ludgrove is a small all boys boarding school, years 4 to 8. We're all boys and we're all boarding, and we're fortnightly exeats. So in terms of the balance between happy home and happy school, we feel we get it right. As I said, we start aged 8 in year 4 and we go through to year 8. And I suppose the reason you do boarding is it's really, really good fun. And school should be all about having fun and growing the character and the confidence and the creativity. And I do think when you're in and around your friends day in, day out, you can grow that character and confidence quicker than anywhere. So that's why we do our boarding, because it's great fun. And then on the back of that, you've got a happy school, and happy boys or happy children are easier to teach. And so academically, we punch high too. So clearly pastoral care lies at the heart of all the schools on the call today. But once you've got the pastoral care buzzing and the boys are happy, they then can be taught well too. So we're a small school of 185 children, and We just want to be kind and do our best.
Here in the heart of Devon, we are a school of about 850 pupils when you consider all the way from age 3 to 18. The prep school finishes at the end of year 6, and there's no boarding at the prep school. So boarding starts in year 7 when pupils join the senior school. And we have one boarding house for year 7s and 8s so that they get that quite specific experience for that age group. And then when they get to year 9, they move into what we call the senior houses. And there are 3 boys' houses, 2 girls' houses. And then finally, when they get to year 13, we have a co-ed year 13 pre-university boarding house. So it's quite a unique split from being co-ed in year 7 and 8, and then single sex and boarding at least from year 9 to 12, and then it's quite unique upper 6th boarding house where we have about 110 18-year-olds under one roof, which seems to work quite well. We're also a boarding school where we have day pupils, flexi boarders, weekly boarders, and full boarders. And one of the lovely things we see over the course of a pupil's school life is that pupils who might have started as day pupils end up as weekly or even full boarders by the time they leave. And that's one of the really lovely things about our model, is that even if you're a day pupil, you still belong to a boarding house. And so you'll find that lots of our day pupils actually stay at school, have tea at school, do their prep, and only go home, basically use home as a bed and breakfast. But largely they actually get the full boarding experience, even though they are actually perhaps just a few hundred meters down the road. But it's that combination, I think, of both boarding and day that we integrate really well, that seems to work for us.
So Bryanston, so relatively recently, 3 years ago, we took on our own prep school. So we operate 2 campuses. So we have our prep school, which is 3 to 13, which is on its own separate campus, but just a mile away from the senior school campus. So that has a small boarding environment where you can board from aged 8 up to age 13. So that has a mixture of full boarding and flexi boarding there in the prep school. And then up in the senior school, which starts in year 9, we have 12 boarding houses. And what's probably quite unique about Bryanston is pretty much every pupil has their own bed here. So we've got about 670 pupils up in the senior school. It's single-sex houses at the senior school. And we have a range. The vast majority are full boarders, but we also have what we call day with bed as well. So that's where a pupil is a day pupil, but then they have their own bed and they choose when they stay in it. So it's effectively flexi, but it's not mixing in and out of beds. It's their own one, their own space within the dorm. A bit like Bart at Blundell's, we don't have separate day houses and boarding houses. There's the 12 houses, and every pupil is part of that. And as Bart said, some who join as maybe that day with bed and they want to build up their boarding, they can do. But certainly as we get through to sixth form, we find that pretty much everybody wants to be a full boarder by the time they get to that age.
As you say, we are heading towards a 400-year-old selective grammar co-ed state school up here in Newport in Shropshire. We are a school of just over 1,000 in terms of our intake, but unlike most boarding schools where perhaps most of the people there are boarders and they would have a minority of day pupils, we're the other way round at Adams. We only have about 10% of our community who are boarders. So it's just about 100 boarders split across 2 houses with roughly 50 pupils in each, the junior and the senior. So it makes for a very, very small, close-knit community. We're in a very, very rural area of Shropshire, lots of grounds around us, both on the school site and also in Shropshire generally. The junior boarders, that's from years 7 up to year 9. So year 7, 8 and 9 are in Longford Hall, which is, we're very lucky. It's a very old Georgian mansion set in 100 acres of play space. And then the senior boarders, who are from year 10 and 11, which is obviously GCSE years, and then 12 and 13 in the sixth form, continue their education with us in Beaumaris Hall, which is a modern boarding house just meters away from the main school campus. And as you've already alluded to, one of the few state boarding schools in the country, pupils are able to enjoy this free grammar school education with boarding at a fraction of the cost of what perhaps a lot of the independent sector have to offer. And the fact that we are, as I say, quite rural in our location is something that is often quite attractive to people, particularly who live in more inner city areas. That we're only just over an hour away from Euston Station in London. So it does afford quite a realistic, nice way of living and working in the country.
Simon, let's begin with Ludgrove. It's an all-boys prep school, as you've already stressed. What do you feel are the advantages of being an all-boys single-sex boarding school, particularly at these ages? And what's the value of staying at your prep school through to 13?
You said Ludgrove is 45 minutes west of London, so I have a lot of conversations with London parents. To take your last question first, the value is when you're forming very, very good friendships. And I mean, just because these assessment places are given out in year 6 to some of these schools, it doesn't mean it says the education stops. I think someone who is thriving at school needs their brain to be stimulated in the classroom as well as outside the classroom. And therefore, year 7 and year 8 are very important years, and sometimes they could be lost unless you keep the academic rigor in place. And that's what a prep school like we try to do. And coming back to your first question in terms of the advantages of single sex versus co-ed, if I'm brutally honest, my line is a happy school is a great school, full stop. So I don't think there's a sort of you're never going to win this argument. There's pluses and minuses for both sets of schools. But all I can say is that I do think they have a huge amount of fun. I do think, having worked in both mixed and single sex schools, perhaps you can have a childhood for a bit longer in year 7 and year 8. Boys tend to do boys things. I know it's slightly stereotypical of that, but certainly my years 7 and 8 are still climbing trees, charging around, getting covered in mud, and playing football every moment of the day, or cricket, or rugby, or going to the art room, or doing music, whatever it might be. But I do think children haven't changed a great deal in 50 years, but society has. And I think that by being able to be a young chap or a young girl in a single-sex environment, year 7, year 8 in particular, is quite attractive to some modern parents who they just want their children to be outside. I think we've all got lucky enough to be in the countryside, and there's nothing that grows your character and confidence than being outside with your friends, away from adults, basically, having fun. So, as I say, I'm not going to sort of come down and say single sex is the way forward the whole way through. But what I would say is a happy school is the way forward, and we've got a very, very happy school.
Now, I'm next looking at Bart from Blundell's and Richard at Bryanston. Your schools both offer co-educational boarding. How do your pupils, do you feel, benefit from having co-educational teaching and a co-educational environment? Perhaps if we start with you, Bart.
Thanks, Chloe. And I agree wholeheartedly with what Simon said about there isn't a right model. I've taught in all boys education now in a co-ed environment now, and both have advantages and disadvantages. So no question about that. And I'd be very reluctant to sort of say which is better than the other. But there is something lovely about in a co-ed environment where, and particularly in our model, where the year 7s and 8s are all together, and then they split off into separate boys and girls' houses, and then they come together again in year 13. But the lovely thing about that is that you want boys and girls to feel comfortable in interacting with each other. But at the same time, and this is where I also, again, agree with Simon, is that there is a space for boys just to be boys together and girls to be girls together. And our house system actually allows it. They're in lessons together, they do plays together, and even some sports now we play together. We're in chapel together. So there's lots of times when boys and girls interacting, but actually in the boarding environment, they withdraw to their own communities and they have that space where they can just, boys can be boys and girls can be girls. One of the things that we really like about our co-ed upper 6th house is when they do live together, it's a slightly different experience to just being in the classroom together. And what we recognize, what we see is that boys and girls do become more considerate over time. And when they first come together at the start of year 13, there is a real period of adjustment. Because like it or not, boys' house has a different feel to it to a girls' house. And when you put them all together at the start of year 13, there is a time where the boys have to realize that they've just got to tone it down a little bit sometimes. And to create that space where girls feel comfortable to be in the kitchen when there's toast and coffee being made, and in the day rooms, the TV rooms, that they do become more mindful of how they interact with each other. And so I think that's a really powerful learning experience where boys and girls become more considerate, more empathetic. They learn so much from being together. But it's also important that they have their own spaces within the school where they can just be with their mates. That's just as important.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Bart has just said. I think ultimately at the senior end, we are there to help prepare them for when they leave ultimately, and the opportunity in our setting for the pupils to, I guess, to navigate those interactions with the opposite members of sex and those relationships that they have. Undoubtedly, it's to be able to have that in an environment where there is support at hand is really, really important, because that's what they're going to experience when they go on to university or whatever route they decide to take post 18. So I think that co-ed environment allows them to do that. As Bart said, having as I said, we have the single sex houses, which allows them the space that they absolutely need to go and have that when they're just with the boys or just with the girls. But actually in the rest of school life, they are interacting and they are mixing. And we're quite lucky here in that we don't have a particularly sort of tribal house system. We very much focus on year groups, whether that's boys or girls. So a lot of all the socials are year group based. When we get to sixth form, the girls, sometimes the upper sixth or lower sixth, will host certain boys' houses to come over, and they'll have might be a wine and cheese evening or whatever it may be, and they'll host each other, and it's fantastic, and they enjoy those social interactions on the weekend in particular. So it's the best of both worlds, really.
Gary, can you explain to the listeners more about state boarding and the provision at Haberdasher Adams?
Yes, indeed, Chloe, yes. Well, as most people know, in the UK, there are two main types of education. There's independent, which obviously is paid for privately, and there's state, which is paid for by the UK government. And according to the ISC, there are just over 500 boarding schools in the UK, and most boarding schools, as most people know, are private institutions, and charge in the region of anywhere just over mid 30,000 to 40,000 a year for the education and boarding. But what a lot of people don't always know about, though, is state boarding. And there are only about 35 state boarding schools in the country. And this is where the families pay for boarding, but the government pays for the education as it would any other state school in England. So this makes boarding a much more affordable option for families. So at a school like Adams, for example, they would pay something in the region of £14,000 a year to board, with no charges whatsoever on top of that for the educational provision. And of course, as a state school, particularly in these testing times, there is no VAT levy. One thing to note, though, is that because the state funds the education, prospective pupils do need to hold a UK passport or have a right to residency to be eligible to apply. So we have a lot of pupils, for example, from expat families abroad, or forces children, or those with dual nationality. The majority of boarders join state boarding schools at the age of 11, so year 7, and continue boarding, nearly all of them, until they leave for university. The other group that normally joins to board is for the sixth form, and boarding, I think, is fair to say, is becoming increasingly popular at sixth form level, with many students choosing to study their A-levels at boarding schools because they recognise boarding as a perfect introduction to living and studying away from home. We describe it at Adams very much as almost a springboard to living in a halls of residence, living perhaps two to a room, as opposed to the lower school boarding house, which is very much more 6, 7 in a dorm, and it's much more boisterous. Exactly, as I would echo totally what Simon said before about, I don't think there is a distinction between a boys' house, a girls' house, this, that, and the other, but fundamentally it needs to be a happy environment. And I think if pupils are happy, they are going to do well in any school. So that, I think, is inherently the difference between state boarding and perhaps boarding schools in the independent sector.
At Haberdashers Adams, the boarding is only for boys. What do you feel is the benefit of that?
Well, we are, as I say, nearly 400 years old. We've had girls in our sixth form for decades now, and only recently we're about to embark upon the second year of us going co-ed. So we had girls into the year seven last year, and we're going to have girls again, obviously, this year as our year sevens go up to year eight. So the co-ed journey of our school is a very, very new one. We are predominantly still a boys' school for another couple of years. Before the girls achieve parity. So we've only ever been set up to have a boys' boarding house. So in a way, for us, it hasn't been a choice up to now because we've only ever always been a boys' boarding house. But I would have no doubt that going forward in the future, there would be no hesitations to becoming a co-ed school in terms of boarding, simply because I think that, as other colleagues have said already on the call, that just reflects society, doesn't it? And there are absolutely benefits to having an all boys boarding house, an all girls boarding house, a co-ed sense of boarding, but it's predominantly about people knowing what is going to be right for their children.
Why do you think that boarding is still an important and necessary provision for so many families in the modern day?
I think boarding works because I think parents are time poor. Lots of them are working very hard, and certainly we're seeing the majority of our parents both work. And I think they realise their children want quality time with other children, and rather than commuting to work or commuting to school, they can spend that quality of time when they would be in the car or the bus or the train, spending time with their peers. These are the children, obviously. And I genuinely think that, as I started with, if you think your children enjoy having fun, when you have the most amount of fun is when you're with your peers. And therefore you're with them 24/7 boarding, and you really do have a fantastic time. I mean, there's huge amounts of research coming out at the moment about screen times, about EdTech, about how that's affecting our children. And certainly you look up and look out an awful lot more when you're with your friends outside on a boarding environment on a Sunday evening, running around having fun. And that's why I think lots of people are sort of predicting the doom and gloom of boarding, but actually I'm quite confident about the boarding because I genuinely think that people are beginning to wake up, that the most important stimulus that children get are from each other and from the environment rather than from the screen. And so that's where I think we are relevant. And I think when we are trying to build resilient characters who are full of confidence and can think for themselves, that's where a boarding comes into its own, not necessarily in the classroom, but outside the classroom is when you learn an awful lot of life. And if you cast your mind back to your own education, probably you remember one or two inspirational teachers, but probably remember the good times when you're outside the classroom. And you obviously spend a lot more time outside the classroom at a boarding school than you might do at a day school.
I can't believe that Simon would suggest that boys would rather spend time with each other rather than with their parents. I know that my own boys would much rather spend a Saturday afternoon with me than with their mates. But that's absolutely true, isn't it? I think that when parents often do consider things like Saturday school, we have Saturday schools like a traditional boarding school, then often when parents talk to us, they say, well, what about family time? And we'll miss out on being together. And you actually do realize that as kids, boys and girls, get older, they actually do prefer to be gainfully employed on a Saturday playing sport or being in lessons or being in an orchestra and things like that. So I think that's right. I think what boarding allows is for pupils to engage with such a breadth of activities in one place with their friends, with teachers who know them and know them well. And I think that's one thing that we're able to do in a boarding environment is really get to know children well, understand their needs, understand what they're passionate about, and so we can direct them to use their time constructively. I think the other part why I think boarding's not going away is, as Simon says, families are busy. And often boarding schools are able to provide the flexibility that many families need. And that varies a little bit from the style of boarding from one school to another, where we have the option of flexi and weekly and full boarding. We see it can be quite fluid, where pupils might start off as day, and depending on family circumstances, that might be what happens with other siblings, the parents' working environment, etc., that we might find that some pupils need to become weekly boarders for a term and then revert to flexi. That's all possible. And I think that is where boarding schools become really significant, because not only do we offer both a productive and an enjoyable environment, but actually there's a pragmatism to the offering that works for many families.
Chloe, can I just quickly jump in on this? Just also to say that if it's very clear what model you've got, whichever school you're in, then the parents can prioritize the family time more, because they know this is when they're going to see, so if we're weekend in, weekend out, so that we start at midday on a Friday, so they know that weekend they're all in family, either the boys are all here or the following weekend they all have to go home. And parents come and watch matches and concerts. We are communities, us, all the schools in the school are communities, but you can really prioritize the time when you will with your children, because you know that when they're at school, they're fully occupied, having a great time, and therefore you can sort yourselves out, and then at the weekends have proper family time.
Yeah.
I didn't go to a boarding school as a child. I went to a day school, but it's interesting that my career in education, every school I've worked at has had more and more boarding as I've gone through. And I think the reason for that is because I see the absolute benefits of a boarding community. I see what it's like, especially when I talk about the senior school up here. You think about teenagers, the number one thing they demand is independence. That's what they want. And when they're in a boarding environment, they get it. They get that element of freedom that they wouldn't ordinarily get if they were at a day school and going home. And Jonathan Haidt is very topical at the moment, and anxious generation, and we overprotect our children in the real world and we underprotect them in the online world. In a boarding environment, they have that. It's brilliant. The sun's shining this evening when school's finished. They'll be outside. They'll be playing. They won't be doing that if they go home, because generally speaking, the move is to overprotect. So the freedoms they get here is fantastic. But the opportunities they have here, it's a bit like being on a centre parks the whole time. They've got all the facilities they need, and they can just go out and try different things, which is, again, it's such an amazing experience for them. And to be able to immerse yourself in your passions, whether that's I finish my supper and I'm going to go and sit in the recording studio, or go and practice the guitar, or I'm going to go up to the sports centre with my friends for a couple of hours, or whatever it may be. You have all those opportunities on your doorstep, and that's amazing. And even more so, as both Simon and Bart have said, this day and age, and I totally agree with the point about being able to allocate time. I think you get really good quality time when your pupils come back from boarding. When they're back, you're actually really excited to see each other, and there's a lot to be said for that as well. So, yeah, I think, again, as we said, boarding can have a bad rep, and historically, and I think people have, if you haven't boarded before and you don't know the environment, people have a perception of boarding. It almost needs bit of a rebrand somehow, because it's very different now to what it's been in the past. And when you open your eyes to that, you see the opportunities that it offers.
I would endorse everything that has been said. I mean, just bullet points, really. You have busy families in society today. Boarding schools offer a stability. They offer a sense of security, especially for the parents, of course. And I think, as everyone's already mentioned, just this opportunities for friendship. Rural schools, I think, especially offer a break from city life. And I think most of the colleagues on the call are in schools that have access, as Richard was saying there, to just play space and getting out and getting to play with their friends in an environment that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily normally be able to do if you just simply went from school to go home. So, yeah, everything that everyone's already said.
I have to agree. When we send London-based parents out to some of the schools in the countryside, they just cannot believe the space, the facilities, the sports, the art room.
Also, an element there that obviously a lot of us will have international boarders too. We have a number of boarders who would come from domestic cities, so London, Birmingham, Manchester, and so on. But also it's really heightened when we have the international element, particularly we find at Adams parents from Hong Kong. We have a large amount of pupils who come from Hong Kong. And of course, their outside space is so restricted that you actually see it even more so with parents who come from environments that are just a different culture as ours as well. And it really is an eye-opener.
Obviously, we're living in very transient times. We deal with a lot of international families. How do you feel that you're able to provide international families with a positive and inclusive boarding experience?
When they find these schools, any school on this call and any school that's doing a good job, they find them inclusive. They find that they are welcome and could come back to, if they got the same values, i.e. doing your best, being kind, having fun and a sense of purpose, you're going to thrive at a place like an independent boarding school. But I just think I think it's a tough gig at the moment running an independent school because of the economic political winds that aren't favourable. But thankfully, there's still a strong demand.
It's a really interesting point that Simon makes, because I think that the international market has matured quite a lot, in the sense that a lot of the children who are coming to us from abroad are second generation boarding children. In other words, their parents, whether they're in Hong Kong or China or in the Middle East or in Nigeria or Kenya, would have boarded themselves at an English school, and they want that same experience. So they're actually knowledgeable, they understand what they're buying into, and they're really committed to it. And so Simon's absolutely right that we're not helping it, we're not encouraging it, we're actually making it increasingly difficult. But it's a sophisticated audience. They know what they're buying and they know what they want from a boarding education. And fundamentally, of course, they want what all parents want. They want their kids to be happy, to be productive, to be thriving in that environment. And I think Richard made an interesting point about Jonathan Haidt's work about pupils being children. We under-supervise them online, we over-supervise in the real world. One of the things that we are able to offer is to give children that sense of adventure, where they can take responsibility for things and do things and have stories to tell. And that's really, I mean, we're all in the business of creating memories for our children, and there's no better place than a boarding environment to create these amazing memories, whether that's about time with friends or whether it's in the classroom or in a Duke of Edinburgh expedition or whatever it might be, the sports fixture on a Saturday. And I think the overseas market want all those things for their children. So it's not something completely different. One of the things that I do think that parents like too is that their children, from wherever they arrive from, that they meet children who are local. And one of the nice things that we have in this model, where we have lots of local kids as well as kids from abroad, is that you can say to a family in Dubai or in Mumbai or in Nairobi that on leave weekends, those children are going out with local Devon families. And so they get to know local families, and those families get to know those children. So on a Saturday when the sports match is happening, it's those local families who also take an interest in these kids who have arrived from the different parts of the world. That's an amazing thing. What it offers us, of course, particularly in a part of the country like Devon, which can be a little bit monoculture, is that our kids here get to meet kids from all over the world. And this is, again, where the short-sightedness of current government policy is we're losing out on soft skills because our kids have this amazing opportunity to learn about other cultures. That can only be good for not only their development, but also from a national perspective. Those are skills that are invaluable. So I think all those things get thrown into that melting pot, and overseas parents want the same as any parent wants for their happy, thriving child.
Thinking about how do we provide those international families with that positive boarding experience, it really starts in that admissions process. I think is really, really important. Making sure that as a school we understand those families, where those peoples are coming from, but also that those families are coming in with their eyes wide open in terms of the type of school that they're potentially sending their child to. So what is the boarding makeup? How many pupils are in on the weekend? How many there on the evening? What sort of activities are put on for them? And I think that's really, really important. And that admissions process has got to be right, because ultimately what all of us want is the pupils and the children that are coming to us to be in the school that's the right place for them, and that they're going to thrive, and that they're going to love it, and that they're going to enjoy it. That's, as we've talked about before, fun and enjoyment are the key words here. And the admissions process is crucial. And I guess at a time when there's no doubt that it's becoming more of a sort of a buyer's market out there, We've just got to make sure that everybody's going through that admissions process and making sure that they're taking pupils that are right for them and that it's the right school for the pupil. I think that's crucial. And then once they're here, there's no surprises, and that settling in process becomes hopefully a lot easier and a lot quicker. And then, as Bart has said there, that mixture of pupils from across the world, again, it just makes for a rich environment, which is fantastic. But also, as schools, we've got to make sure and we recognise that international pupils they do want to. There'll be times when putting them doing events with other international pupils who they can share experiences with is really important as well. And I'm sure we'll all have, pupil leaders who are responsible for our international pupils and different projects that go on in that way. Last year I was in Kenya and I flew back with 4 or 5 of our Kenyan pupils. And only when you actually go through that journey with them do you understand the unbelievable efforts they go to come to school in the UK. A 3-hour drive to the airport, sit in the airport for 2 hours, a 9-hour flight, couple of hours at the other end, and you think they're doing that on a pretty regular basis just to come to school here. It's unbelievable, really. And it goes back to, again, what everyone said about the strength of UK education. It's we've got to try and protect it despite everything we're up against.
I mean, for me, the underlying principle is this awareness and experience of different cultures and diversity, because it's one of the very, very few places, I think, where you literally live, sleep and work with your peers from around the world. And most boarding schools would have a very long history of international students, and so are well versed in different cultures. So something that really brought it home to me a few years ago, this was before, unfortunately, Brexit came along, when we were allowed to have pupils from obviously Europe as a state boarding school. As soon as Brexit happened, that market was closed down to us. But we used to have a lot of pupils from Spain. And we found out, for example, just on one of the leavers days just before Christmas, where the parents came to collect, one of the boys was a little bit visibly upset. And it wasn't that he was leaving the school for the holidays, although I'm sure he was upset about that as well. But he was more upset because he was going to miss in Spain King's Day. And for those who are familiar with the Spanish culture, King's Day comes after Christmas and after New Year's Day for us. And it is quite probably one of the most important family celebration days in the Spanish culture. But it's often the 1st, 2nd or 3rd of January, which would have meant he would have had to miss that to get back in school for the start of term. Once we realised it, it's a very, very, very quick fix for us to say, look, actually, just come back a day later. The wheels won't fall off of your life educationally. And it's having an awareness of that culture is important. And it literally transformed not just this man, but the Spanish pupils that we had at the time, because that day was so crucial for them as family. And the boy was upset because he thought he'd miss it. We can talk about it. We can learn about it and make a very, very quick fix about it, that he just simply joins 24 hours later. Everyone is happy. But what it also does is not only cement those relationships with the families, because it's an awareness of the culture, but it means that those boys can come back and tell our boys about this aspect of different cultures as well. And to me, probably this awareness of differing cultures and diversity is probably one of the most crucial things for young people at this time. Because for our younger pupils, and for our younger pupils, year 7 and 8, so 10, 11 years old, the world is quite a daunting place for them at the moment. And it's full of a lot of worries, and it's full of a lot of scary things about different people and different cultures. So for me, tolerance and exposure to the wider world is just so, so important right now, perhaps more than ever. And a good boarding house can absolutely cement that for life.
What's important to many parents is emotional support and well-being when they're considering a school, and particularly a boarding school. Could each of you tell us a little bit more about the pastoral care and how you support the boarders?
It starts right from the first phone call, because you are effectively trusting your most precious possession to a school. So you want to be completely confident the people looking after your children are absolutely first class. And therefore, right from the get-go, from the admissions all the way through to new boys' days, through to actually arriving. I think the more communication, the better. I think, as I say, trust is absolutely fundamental in all this. And I think never assume you can't do things better. And we all pride ourselves on our pastoral care, but you're always looking at how to support and improve what you do. You need to, I think one of our major jobs as heads is to recruit and retain amazing staff who do it not just for the academic side of life, but the pastoral side of life is equally important because, as I said earlier in the call, if you've got happy children, they're much easier to teach. So, the pastoral element and the emotional support underpins any school, and there are all sorts of sort of professional services out there if you need to ramp it up, if you need a bit more emotional or well-being support. And as I said earlier as well, I don't think children have changed a great deal, but society has, which has made things more difficult for children. So schools are having to be fleet-footed and making sure that they are continually reviewing how their children are thriving and when they're not. And actually, having boarding houses means your pastoral care staff get to know the children incredibly well and sees what makes them tick. Have they got the spring in the step? Is the sparkle in their eyes? And if it's not there, you can jump on it pretty quickly because you know them incredibly well. And that's why I think we're successful as schools, is because we really can hopefully nip issues in the bud early. But that's not to sort of cast over the fact that some children do need some proper support. And I think we all have pastoral care we're very proud of, but sometimes you need to bring in professional services as well. So as I said, we're always looking at ways to improve. But the parents, first and foremost, must have complete faith and trust in the school. And there's got to be very good communication between the school and the parents because it's a partnership.
The interesting part of this conversation, and both Simon and Richard mentions, is the preparation that goes into work that goes in before children arrive, and trying to know and get to know as much about the child, but also building the relationship with parents and with the pupil in anticipation of their arrival, so that when they come, that both the parents feel confident that their child is known, but that very quickly the pupil feels that they are both all the pupils and peers and adults who are reliable and who they can turn to. I think that's one of the lovely things about this environment, and why I imagine we're all in boarding, is that the rapport between staff and pupils in a boarding setting is different to in a day setting. And we're able to get to know children so well because we see them in the classroom, we see them on the stage and sports fields, but then we also see them in their homes, their boarding houses. And they get to see us, not just as a classroom teacher or sports coach, but they also see us in a more relaxed and natural environment. And I think that's very powerful. So a lot of the pastoral care stems from the fact that we get to know our pupils extraordinarily well. And we recruit staff with that in mind. Professionals who are not just good at the disciplines of teaching and coaching, but who also have an instinct for good pastoral care. And so we also have various structures in place, tutor groups, house staff, matrons, and the next layer of support, I suppose, in terms of school counsellors and medical centre, all those layers of support to make sure that once a child arrives, they are going to be very well cared for.
As you've heard, we've, all our schools and anyone that runs boarding have got really strong processes in place. We're lucky here that we have a one-to-one tutor system that starts from year 7. So as a boarding parent, you kind of have one person there, that one-to-one tutor who you can go to with any questions, certainly on the academic side. And then you have your house parent for anything to do with the pastoral. So that's I think that really helps. It's really reassuring. You've got 2 members of staff who have complete oversight of your own child. So that works really well and goes down well with all our boarding parents. But it's those bits, like I say, not necessarily in the boarding house or in the classroom, but it's your cafe staff, it's your catering staff who see these children and welcome them into the dining hall for lunch and supper and breakfast. And they know when something's off as well. They're your extra eyes and ears that make a big difference. And it's recognising that again, people join the senior schools with different levels of boarding experience, and some of them have boarded before, others have never boarded, and it's just making them understand that homesickness is natural, and parents have got to trust the staff, trust the school, that they are seeing them all the time. So yeah, everybody gets used to boarding at a different pace, and I think it's just understanding that as well, and like I say, trusting the staff because they all get there.
Now I'm going to mention the dreaded words VAT on fees. They were introduced at the beginning of the year and they've had a significant impact. Would you like to tell us how you're working to support the families despite the introduction of VAT?
So I don't think we've got the full picture of VAT yet. It only came in on the 1st of January. We'll know during the Easter holidays when people start handing in terms notices in terms of September. I think the vast majority of parents were committed to doing this academic year. They hoped that it wasn't going to come until September 2025, but obviously it's come in 2 terms earlier than expected. So the VAT picture is very hard to call. Touch wood, we haven't seen anything as yet, but I imagine the sector will get a sort of a proper sort of snapshot of where we're going to be before the beginning of the summer term. But every school will be doing their utmost to look after their parents wherever possible.
Even before that came in, boarding school fees are eye-wateringly expensive, and that's the reality, and that has exacerbated that too. And I think most schools are really conscious of that and conscientious about saving costs. Look, the reality is too, of course, over the last 7 or 8 years through COVID and beyond, there's lots to be said in the press that school fees have grown at a faster rate than inflation. That's not entirely accurate. So, since 2017, CPI inflation has been around high 20%, and I think school fees is probably in most instances about in low 30s. So it's maybe a little bit higher than inflation. But also during that period, wage growth has been around 40%. So I think we've got to see this in the context that schools have not been irresponsible about raising fees, but we've had circumstances which have caused fees to become really, really expensive. And we recognize that, and we need to be sensitive to it. I think what it does go on from there is to say we need to ensure that school represents good value. And I think that's the target for us. As school fees become more expensive, due to that we ensure that the product remains something that is worth it. We believe it is. And we work hard to make sure that we continue to invest in our facilities, that we work really hard to make sure that parents aren't paying more for less, but actually they're paying more, that we keep on delivering something that is of such high quality that parents will continue to make the sacrifice.
In terms of supporting current families, we're doing all we can to support those parents who are in school at the moment who are finding it difficult to take on the additional cost. We don't have a huge endowment or foundation here at Bryanston, but the foundation we have got are being supportive with that and helping us, which is great. We want to look after and repay the faith that our current families have put in us. And what none of us know is what's going to come down the line. Ultimately, we don't know what's going to happen over the next few years in terms of the decisions that parents are going to have to take. Again, speaking to friends of mine who've got kids similar age, you're looking at it now. You're looking at that journey that you've got to go on, and the cost it is incredibly high. And there's big decisions to be made. And as schools, we're going to have to be really, really flexible as to how we respond to that. I think there will always be a flight to quality in terms of those, especially boarding environments that really do maintain that full boarding offering and that do offer all the brilliant additional extras that we've talked about on this call. As soon as you start cutting those, and that's obviously the danger, and you weaken that offering, and it comes back again, value to money. If you do that, then we're going to be in trouble. But it's in between a rock and a hard place at the moment, many schools. So it's tough. Like I say, it's going to require some flexibility and a really strategic board as well, and making sure that we've got good people around us as heads to help with that decision making, because we can't all do it ourselves. There's no doubt about it. It's going to be a tricky time for the sector. But I'm confident that whenever there's challenges, there's always opportunities as well.
And finally, how do you see the future of boarding schools changing in the next decade?
I think we're in a very challenging time at the moment. And by that, I just mean the world. There's a lot of upheaval and a lot of uncertainty at the moment. We cannot avoid the political climate that we're in, both, I think, domestically and internationally. as we used to say frequently during the COVID times, this too shall pass. And we can only hope that that is the case. I think history has told us that there is turmoil and there is calm, probably in equal measure. We are going to have an interesting few years without a doubt. I think what we have to be able to do in boarding is reassure children fundamentally, I mean, for that matter, some adults too, but we are going to have to be reassuring children that their place in the world is going to be just as important and just as secure as it always has been, and that they are going to have massively bright futures ahead of them. And I think the challenge, if there is one for boarding staff, is to be able to do that, which I think we all do, but to be able to do it in the face of a reflection in the mirror of the world around them that is perhaps at the moment to them everything that a good boarding house isn't. Not calm, not stable, not people working together, and not often being very kind. So I think a lot of what's going to happen in the upcoming few years is about reassurance. It's going to be about offering stability, and it's going to be making sure that we can send out the very, very best young men and women into society as we possibly can, because those are the sorts of skills that young people are going to be needing now when they become older people. And I think that's exactly the role of a boarding school. And I go right back to where I think it was Simon who started off by saying there is no right or wrong answer to a boys' school, a girls' school, a co-ed, a prep school, a senior, whatever. It's got to be what parents who know their children best know is what is going to be the right environment for their child, and not to be swayed by all the other noise. So in answer to the question, how will schools change perhaps in the next 10 years? That's certainly where the eyes that I would have on the future.
We all know, as you said, Simon, that happy children learn best and happy children do well. I know most of your schools quite well, and I think that they all have happy children within them. Thank you so much for giving up your time, and it's so lovely to have heard about Ludgrove, Blundell's, Bryanston and Haberdashers Adams. Thank you.